In 73 BCE, a young slave girl named Livia screams as red-hot iron burns through her cheek, searing her master's initials into her flesh forever. But that's not even the worst part, because what happened next in Rome's underground chambers makes modern torture look like child's play. I'm about to reveal 3 methods of slave punishment so brutal that even hardened Roman soldiers refuse to watch. We're talking about tortures that were so horrifying, some were actually banned by Roman law, and yet they still happened behind closed doors across the empire. By the end of this video, you'll understand why historians tried to bury these stories for centuries, and why what you're about to learn will forever change how you see the glorious Roman Empire. Here's what I promised to show you. First, the branding technique that destroyed a person's identity in the most permanent way imaginable. Second, how Romans literally buried slaves alive and kept them conscious for days. And finally, the crucifixion method that makes the version you learned about in school seem merciful. If you want to uncover history's darkest secrets that your textbooks never dared to print, hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to learn will change how you see the ancient world forever. And trust me, you want to see my next video about Roman gladiator training methods that were even worse than this. But here's what nobody tells you about ancient Rome. Behind all that marble and glory lived over 1 million slaves. That's roughly 1/3 of the entire population of the empire's capital. These weren't just servants or laborers, they were the literal backbone of Roman civilization. And their suffering built every temple, road, and monument we admire today. Now you might think you know about Roman cruelty from movies like Gladiator or shows like Spartacus, but here's the thing, Hollywood actually toned it down. The real story is so much worse that most historians have spent centuries avoiding the details. Here's where it gets really twisted. Roman law actually had protections for slaves. Masters couldn't legally kill them without cause, couldn't torture them beyond certain limits, and had to provide basic food and shelter. These laws existed because Romans saw themselves as civilized, superior to the barbarian tribes they conquered. But, and this is crucial, those laws only applied to public spaces and official proceedings. What happened in private villas, underground chambers, and remote estates? That's where the real horror began. Imagine you're a slave in Rome. You've broken a dish, spoken back to your master, or tried to run away. The law says you can't be killed, but it says nothing about what can be done to make you wish you were dead. What I'm about to show you comes from 3 main sources: Pliny the Older's detailed accounts, archaeological evidence discovered in Pompeii's preserved villas, and the shocking testimony of Seneca, a Roman philosopher who witnessed these punishments firsthand and was so disturbed he wrote about them as a warning to future generations. Don't click away yet, because the first method I'm revealing was so psychologically devastating that it broke slaves before the physical pain even began. Picture this. You're dragged into a torchlit room where the smell of burning charcoal fills your nostrils. Your master holds a glowing iron brand shaped like his initials. But this isn't just any punishment. This is the complete destruction of your humanity. The branding iron isn't applied to your arm or shoulder like in the movies. No, Romans branded faces. Specifically, they burned the master's initials directly onto the slave's forehead or cheek, making it impossible to hide, impossible to forget, and impossible to ever blend into free society again. Pliny the Elder documented dozens of these cases, and his accounts are absolutely chilling. He describes how masters would heat the iron until it glowed white-hot, then press it into the flesh for exactly 10 seconds, long enough to burn through the skin and into the muscle beneath, ensuring the scar would never fade. But here's what makes this even more horrifying. The branding wasn't about pain, it was about identity destruction. A branded slave could never pretend to be free, could never escape their past, and could never start over somewhere else. Every person who saw them would instantly know they were property, and worse, property that had been problematic enough to deserve permanent marking. The psychological torture was deliberate. Imagine looking in any reflective surface and seeing your master's initials burned into your face for the rest of your life. Imagine your own children seeing those letters and knowing exactly what their parent had endured. Archaeologists have found specialized branding tools in Roman villas, custom-made iron stamps with intricate family crests and initials. These weren't crude instruments. They were precision tools designed for maximum psychological impact. Some even had decorative elements around the letters, turning human flesh into a twisted form of property advertisement. Pliny writes about one case where a slave named Marcus was branded with his master's full name, Gaius Julius Maximus, across his entire forehead. The process took multiple sessions because the iron had to be reheated between each letter. Marcus was conscious for all of it. But here's the truly sick part. Some masters would brand their slaves' faces with lies. They'd burn thief or runaway into foreheads of slaves who had never committed those crimes, just to justify future punishments or to destroy their credibility if they ever tried to testify in court. But branding was just the beginning, because what Romans did to problem slaves underground will haunt your dreams. What I'm about to describe was discovered in 1982 beneath a preserved Roman villa in Pompeii, and it's so disturbing that the Italian government restricted access to the site for over a decade. Archaeologists found a series of stone chambers, each barely large enough for one person to crouch inside. But these weren't storage rooms or wine cellars. They were torture chambers, designed for one specific purpose: burying slaves alive while keeping them conscious for as long as possible. Here's how it worked. A problem slave, someone who had tried to escape, challenged their master, or committed theft, would be forced into one of these stone boxes. The chamber was exactly calculated, tall enough to sit up but not stand, wide enough to extend your arms but not lie down flat. But here's where Roman engineering turned truly evil. The chambers had small air holes, just enough to prevent immediate suffocation, but not enough for comfortable breathing. The slave would be sealed inside with exactly 3 days' worth of water and no food. The Pompeii excavation revealed 12 of these chambers, and 8 still contained human remains. But it gets worse. Scratch marks on the stone walls show that victims tried to claw their way out. Some had worn their fingernails down to the bone, scratching at solid rock. Roman historian Tacitus described witnessing one of these punishments. The condemned slave begged for a quick death, but the master replied that death was too merciful. He would learn what it meant to challenge his betters while buried in darkness, counting each breath until the earth claimed him. The psychological torture was methodical. Day 1, panic and desperate attempts to escape. Day 2, dehydration and delirium set in. Day 3, acceptance of death, but death wouldn't come for hours more. Some victims lasted 4 days because the air holes provided just enough oxygen to prolong the agony. What makes this even more sick is that this punishment wasn't illegal. Roman law prohibited killing slaves without cause, but technically the slave was dying from natural causes, suffocation and dehydration. Masters could claim they were simply confining problematic property until it reformed. Telenum, masters would visit the chambers during the punishment, speaking through the air holes to ask if the slave was ready to behave properly. Those who begged convincingly might be released after 2 days, broken, traumatized, but alive, as an example to others. Yet even this wasn't Rome's most twisted invention. That honor belongs to a practice so sick it required special tools that archaeologists still find in Roman ruins today. Forget everything you think you know about Roman crucifixion. What they taught you in school was the merciful version, the quick death that important political prisoners received. But for slaves, Romans invented methods that could keep a person alive and conscious on the cross for over a week. Seneca the Younger witnessed these extended crucifixions firsthand, and his accounts are so detailed they read like torture manuals. He describes seeing slaves on crosses equipped with small platforms for their feet, not to ease their suffering, but to prevent them from dying too quickly from asphyxiation. Here's how Roman engineers perfected prolonged crucifixion. First, they nailed the victim's wrists, not palms, to the crossbeam using specially designed iron spikes with flanged heads that prevented tearing through flesh. But here's the sick innovation. They'd also install a small wooden seat called a sedile between the victim's legs. This wasn't mercy, it was calculated cruelty.
The sedile allowed crucified slaves to partially support their weight, which meant they could breathe properly and stay conscious much longer. Instead of dying from suffocation in 6 to 8 hours, they could survive for days. But it gets worse. Masters would hire doctors to attend the crucifixions. These physicians would administer stimulants to keep slaves awake, provide just enough water to prevent death from dehydration, and even treat wounds if they became infected, all to extend the suffering as long as possible. Seneca describes walking along Roman roads where hundreds of these modified crosses line the highways. He writes, "I saw slaves who had been hanging for 5 days, still conscious, still pleading for death. Their masters visited daily, not to show mercy, but to ensure their property was suffering adequately." The psychological torture was just as calculated as the physical. Family members, spouses, children, parents were forced to watch. Some masters would crucify entire slave families together, making them watch each other die slowly over several days. One of Seneca's most disturbing accounts describes a slave named Darius, who tried to escape with his wife and infant son. All 3 were crucified using the extended method. Darius lasted 6 days, his wife 4, and their baby, the master showed no mercy, even for children, died on the 2nd day. Darius was forced to watch his family die while he remained conscious. Romans even created portable crucifixion kits, collapsible crosses with built-in sediles that traveling masters could assemble anywhere. Rebellion had to be punished immediately, wherever it occurred. But all of these pale in comparison to what happened when slaves tried to escape and got caught, because what I'm about to reveal makes everything else look like mercy. I know this is getting incredibly dark, but if you're still watching, you're clearly as fascinated by history's brutal truths as I am. Before I reveal the most shocking punishment of all, make sure you're subscribed, because next week I'm exposing the Roman gladiator training methods that were somehow even worse than what we're discussing today. And trust me, you won't believe what they did to volunteers who tried to join the games for money. In 71 BCE, the Roman general Marcus Cassus did something so horrifying that it haunts historians to this day. After crushing Spartacus's slave rebellion, he lined the Appian Way, Rome's most important road, with exactly 6,000 crucified slaves. But this wasn't ordinary crucifixion. This was a 120-meter display of extended torture designed to break the spirit of every slave in the empire. Picture this. You're traveling from Rome to Brindisi, and for 3 entire days of walking, you never escape the sight and sound of dying slaves. Every few meters, another cross. Every cross, another human being slowly dying in agony. The smell was so overwhelming that wealthy Romans had to take alternate routes for months. But here's what makes this even more sick. Crassus used the extended crucifixion method I just described on all 6,000 slaves, with platforms, water rations, and medical attention to keep them alive as long as possible. The first slaves died after 4 days. The last ones lived for over a week. Plutarch, the Roman historian, wrote that you could hear the screaming from 5 miles away. Local residents fled their homes because the psychological torture of listening to 6,000 people dying slowly was unbearable, even for hardened Romans who were used to gladiatorial games. But here's the twisted irony that ultimately doomed Rome. This extreme brutality backfired spectacularly. Instead of preventing future slave revolts, it convinced every slave in the empire that death in rebellion was preferable to capture. Slave uprisings actually increased after Spartacus, becoming more desperate and more violent. The moral decay that allowed such systematic dehumanization infected Roman society from the ground up. Citizens became desensitized to suffering. Leaders competed to show who could be more cruel, and the empire slowly lost the civic virtues that had made it great in the first place. Seneca himself recognized this connection. He wrote, "We who torture our slaves have tortured our own souls. We who deny humanity to others have lost our own humanity." Rome builds monuments to its glory on foundations of screaming stone. The ultimate irony. Those 6,000 crucified slaves became martyrs whose suffering inspired the very revolts that eventually contributed to Rome's collapse. Every extreme punishment created more desperate enemies. Every act of brutality proved to conquered peoples that Romans were the true barbarians. Within 400 years, this empire that built its power on systematic torture had crumbled. The descendants of those crucified slaves, through various paths of history, helped tear down the system that had created such unthinkable suffering. The slaves of Rome never forgot what was done to them, and neither should we. These weren't isolated incidents or the actions of a few sadistic masters. This was systematic dehumanization on an industrial scale, woven into the very fabric of Roman civilization. We're talking about a society that perfected torture the way we perfect technology, methodically, scientifically, and with pride in their innovation. But here's what disturbs me most. The capacity for this level of cruelty still exists in human nature today. The same psychological mechanisms that allowed Roman citizens to ignore the screaming from underground chambers are still operating in modern societies that look the other way from systematic oppression. Rome fell, but the lessons from their brutality remain terrifyingly relevant. When we dehumanize others, whether through slavery, genocide, or any form of systematic oppression, we plant the seeds of our own moral destruction. So here's my question for you. Which of these punishments shocked you most? And more importantly, what does it say about human nature that we're capable of such calculated cruelty? Let me know in the comments if you can even bring yourself to think about it. And if you want to see how Roman gladiator training methods was somehow even worse than everything we just discussed, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. Trust me, next week's video will make this one look tame.